Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your time. Thank you to our distinguished panel of guests. Tonight, we're going to be discussing a question that's often reduced to slogans, but deserves careful analysis. And that is that how did Hamas move from being an armed resistance movement into a governing authority? And what shaped its trajectory once it did? But before we do that, I need to state an important legal disclaimer. Hamas is currently a proscribed organization in the UK under the Terrorism Act 2000. As such, inviting support for it or expressing support for it as a proscribed group constitutes a serious criminal offence. While this position may be at odds with the position taken by the vast majority of governments around the world, and while legal proceedings challenging that prescription are ongoing in court, unless and until Hamas is deprescribed, it remains a criminal offence to express or invite support for the organization. Accordingly, nothing said, asked, or presented during this webinar by our hosts, panel, or audience members is intended to be, nor should it be interpreted as, an invitation or expression of support for the group. This event is strictly an objective, retrospective policy analysis of a 20-year governance period and its regional geopolitical implications. And we'd ask that all participants, the panelists and the attendees, to maintain this analytical framework throughout the presentations and the subsequent Q&A. So to proceed, we are at an extraordinary historical turning point in the history of Palestine. 3 weeks ago, Hamas announced the formal dissolution of its government emergency committee in the Gaza Strip, officially concluding a 2-decade era of formal administrative rule. To trace how we got to this point, we have to go back to the 1990s and the Oslo Accords. Hamas, along with other Palestinian factions, opposed Oslo from the start because the agreement, in their view, risked entrenching the occupation rather than ending it. And that opposition led to Hamas boycotting the 1996 legislative elections, although it began building influence on the ground through its grassroots organizing and social services. In 2005, following Israel's physical withdrawal from Gaza, Hamas entered electoral politics directly, running against a Fatah party widely seen as corrupt and too closely aligned with the security demands of the occupation. Hamas, by contrast, had built a reputation for clean governance and genuine resistance credentials. Its electoral platform for the 2006 Legislative Council elections, the Change and Reform List, was itself a document of political evolution, combining its long-standing commitment to resistance with concrete governance proposals, anti-corruption measures, social justice, and national unity. And despite Washington's public backing of the democratic process, US officials had signaled well in advance that a Hamas win would not be accepted. President Bush reportedly warned President Abbas that Palestinians would, I quote, pay a cost for voting the wrong way. The Palestinians voted anyway. Turnout was 77%, and an international observer delegation led by former US President Jimmy Carter concluded that the election was free, fair, and secure and reflected the will of the Palestinian people. Hamas won a decisive majority of parliamentary seats. Now, what follows is central to understanding everything that comes after. Fatah refused to join a unity government and crucially retained control of the security forces and the Interior Ministry even after losing the legislature. Security personnel loyal to Fatah refused to cooperate with the new administration, producing the chaos that led Hamas to stand up its own executive force in Gaza. Meanwhile, the international community, the quartet of the US, Russia, the EU, and the UN, publicly congratulated the Palestinian people on a free and fair vote, but simultaneously made future assistance conditional on Hamas renouncing violence, recognizing Israel, and disarming. When those conditions weren't met, Israel, the US, and the EU cut off transferred revenues and funding, effectively sanctioning a democratically elected government for the outcome of its own election. Thereafter, Israel, the US, Egypt, and Fatah collaborated to seek to weaken and ultimately remove the Hamas-led government, culminating in the 2007 split between Gaza and the West Bank. What followed was a deeply complex historical paradox. Attempting to operate a civil municipal government while maintaining a national liberation identity under a suffocating 20-year land, air, and sea blockade, including a documented calculation of minimum caloric intake used to regulate food entering Gaza. For 2 decades, the Hamas administration was forced to balance the daily civic needs of a besieged population, schools, hospitals, basic infrastructure, with the reality of surviving repeated severe military invasions by the Israeli occupation forces. These policies, which scholars have described as de-development, shape not just Gaza's economy, but the very conditions under which any Palestinian government, Hamas or otherwise, would have had to operate. So the question we're really asking today is not simply how is Hamas governed? It's a more layered one. How much room to govern was Hamas actually given by both its Palestinian rivals and the international community once it won at the ballot box? Now, this status quo shattered entirely following the Tufan al-Aqsa operation on the 7th of October 2023. The subsequent Israeli genocide fundamentally reordered the region and completely leveled Gaza's civic landscape. Under a heavily altered international landscape and a framework linked to Trump's Board of Peace, Gaza's civil administration is now transitioning to a civilian technocratic body. By stepping down, Hamas has stated it intends to remove any remaining pretexts for occupation and facilitate the unhindered flow of humanitarian relief. This transition leaves us with vital questions regarding the future of Palestinian self-determination, Palestinian resistance, and Gaza itself. To discuss these issues, we are joined by a distinguished panel of Palestinian experts. We have Dr. Azam Tamimi, a British Palestinian political analyst and commentator, known extensively for his work on Islamic political thought. He's written numerous books, including Hamas Unwritten Chapters and Rashid Ghanouchi, Democrat Within Islamism. From Istanbul, we have Professor Sami Al-Arian, a Palestinian-American civil rights activist, public intellectual, and the founding director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul's Zaim University. Professor Al-Arian has authored countless publications and books on Islam and the West, civil rights, Palestine, and US foreign policy. And finally, joining us from Dublin is Abu Bakr Abid, a Palestinian war correspondent originally from Deir al-Bala refugee camp in Gaza. Driven by the escalations of October 2023, he reported directly on the ground before relocating to Ireland in April 2025, having lived under Hamas's rule for most of his life. So without any further ado, I'd like to give the mic to Dr. Azam Al-Tamimi for an opening speech.
Well, thank you very much, Fahad. You've really summed up the history of leading to the current situation we find ourselves in. I would like also to emphasize that it is my understanding that Hamas never intended to compete for ruling the West Bank and Gaza, or either of these two areas that had been under Israeli occupation since 1967. My understanding also is that when Hamas agreed in 2006 to participate in the elections, contrary to its earlier decision 10 years earlier in 1996, when it refused to participate, is that its decision to participate this time in 2006 was based on the assessment that Oslo was dead or almost dead. And actually, the pronouncing the death of Oslo was done by the Israeli Prime Minister Sharon himself, who earlier, and probably just around the year 2004, said this explicitly. He explicitly said that Oslo was dead. He was against continuing the peace process with the Palestinian Authority. And he then took the decision to withdraw unilaterally from the Gaza Strip, and intended, had he remained in power longer, to even withdraw from certain parts of the West Bank. So I think Hamas' decision to participate in the 2006 elections was motivated by an assessment that led them to believe that they were dealing with the circumstances that were completely different from those that existed, that persisted or existed 10 years earlier when Oslo was still fresh and the Palestinian Authority was still young. What went in the minds of the Hamas decision makers at the time is really difficult to tell, apart from the fact that they saw this as part of the struggle. Of course, there were other Palestinian factions who disagreed with them. This was a matter of ijtihad anyway. I mean, how do you deal with a situation in which Gaza was no longer directly occupied because the Israelis had withdrawn their troops and had withdrawn their settlers, although practically it remained really occupied because it remained under siege, under the control of the Israelis. The withdrawal of the Israelis in 2005 did not liberate the Gaza Strip simply because the shackles were jointly imposed on the people of the Strip, not only by the Israeli occupiers, but also by the regional powers as well as the international, so-called international community. So actually, it wasn't a competition for power. It wasn't let's go and fight this election in the hope that we will win it and then we will become the government. I think what they had in mind was that this participation in the election, irrespective of the outcome, was going to participate in the creation of the new reality that was going to depart from the Oslo pathway, and that was going to be a completely different reality that is paving the way for the end of occupation, or at least for an end of the occupation of certain parts of the so-called occupied territories. Of course, to the majority of the Palestinians, the whole of Palestine, referred to sometimes as British Mandate Palestine or as historic Palestine, is occupied. But in terms of terminology, usually the term occupied territories applied to the West Bank and to the Gaza Strip. And this is what, these were the areas that Hamas thought, because of Sharon's decision at the time, were going to become they were going to see a different reality. I think I will stop here and probably join you later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. We can just pass the mic to Dr. Samuel Arian from Turkey, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Brother Fahd, Dr. Fahd. And in the few minutes I have, I would like to just address two questions. Certainly, these two questions would take more time than I'm allowed, so I will address them briefly. The first question I'd like to answer is, what is Hamas and what does it want? When we talk about the ruling of Hamas in Gaza, we have to describe what Hamas is, how it evolved, but more importantly, what does it want? And the second question I would like to answer, which pertains to the genocide that we've witnessed for the past 3 years or so, which is, why did Hamas attack in October 7th, 2023? If we can answer these questions, I think the topic that you raised could be better understood. On the first question, as you know, Hamas started as a movement, as a resistance movement, with the emergence of the first Intifada in the late 1987, beginning of 1988, as a resistance movement. And certainly during that Intifada, which lasted for about 3 years, it died down with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the subsequent American invasion of Iraq to liberate Kuwait. And then we had to witness an American activity in order to address the Palestinian question, but mostly on Israeli terms, and what was first termed as the Madrid process, and then got into the Oslo process. By that time, we have the Clinton administration. And you alluded to it in your introduction. What the Oslo process simply was an attempt by the Israelis to achieve their goals through a process that was erroneously called a peace process, But what it was to marginalize the Palestinian question, to take out the resistance that came for decades from the Fatah movement, which was basically a secular movement, yet it was a resistance movement. But how we can make that movement being a movement that can engage into some kind of a process, and we're trying to marginalize it, or we're trying to take away the resistance factor from it, which they successfully were able to do that for 30 years. Hamas at the time, as Dr. Azam said, its understanding of the process was this not a process by which there was even mutual recognition, even though the Palestinian official leadership recognized Israel on 78% of historical Palestine, and the reciprocal recognition was that the PLO would be representing the Palestinians in future negotiations rather than an acknowledgement of either a Palestinian state or a Palestinian society or a future Palestinian state or some kind of a political resolution that will end with Palestinian self-determination. None of that was given. And we could see throughout this process, the Palestinians were stripped from every source that, or every leverage that could actually make a difference in these negotiations. We saw the settlements and settlers went from about 125,000. Today, they're over 800,000. There was absolutely no intention on the part of the Israelis, regardless of the government, whether they were willing or are willing, or in the future, they would be willing to have any kind of a political settlement. The idea was always to marginalize the Palestinians. And I think it was best captured with the latest government when Smotrich said at the beginning of 2023, as a finance minister, the Palestinians have three options. One, that they have to acknowledge that this is a Jewish state, that they have no rights, no civil rights, no political rights. They are there at the invitation of the state, and they have to acknowledge this and live as such, meaning that they have to consider themselves not even second, but third or fourth class citizens. And if they don't like it, and he said, I understand it, they could be compensated. And if not, the third option is death. Otherwise, in other words, there are no real settlements. Hamas realized that from the very beginning, even though it was always willing to open the door for future negotiations, future settlement. And we could see that very vividly, not only in its acceptance of the terms set in the 2006 elections, which were under Oslo, and they entered under Oslo. Unlike other factions who rejected this whole thing, they went into the process, they won the month. Within a year, there was a coup against them, and you can find the complete details of this coup in the Vanity Fair article that came, I think, in 2009, in which it has details how there was a coup against Hamas, but Hamas was able to figure it out and actually have an armed insurrection to prevent the coup from taking place and obliterate its presence in Gaza. And yet Hamas was always willing to negotiate, willing to accommodate, willing to be part of the process, as long as it would lead to somewhere, to something, rather than to some empty promises. Even in 2017, it changed its charter, which was under pressure, particularly from Tony Blair and other European countries, that you need to moderate your stance so that we can engage you. And they were given also much promises. Even that compromise never really gave it any notion of acceptance in Western capitals, because we've seen this movie before. We've seen it with Fatah throughout the years, from the 1974, that so-called 10-point plan, all the way to the 1988 recognition and the declaration of so-called Declaration of Independence, and the renouncement of terrorism, that is of armed resistance, all the way to Oslo. None of these concessions were enough, either for Israel or for the Western states, to accept any notion of the Palestinians. So Hamas was not willing to go that road, even though it was showing all kinds of on the part of getting engaged. And then the bottom line, for the answer to the first question, is that what Hamas wanted was a resolution that is based in dignity, that is based on rights, that is based on justice, that is based on all, even the international resolutions. And even you could find it in some of its statements that it was relying on these kind of international legitimacy to get the Palestinian question on the agenda, and it was willing to play ball. We have many examples, but I will spare that unless people ask me specifically. In other words, Hamas has proven through its record from the time it was it is initiated as a resistance movement that it rejects the occupation, it rejects the Israeli oppression and oppressive measures in Palestine, but it was willing to engage the stakeholders, the international community, the Arab regimes, in trying to reach some sort of a political accommodation. It was not allowed to do so. It was willing to engage into electoral politics. It did. It won. It wanted to bring a government that could be held to account by its people. It was never allowed to rule. It was boycotted from day one. Israel set the conditions by which the whole world was dancing to its tune. Now, the second question is, what happened in between the time that Hamas took over Gaza and was under these tremendous pressures and the day they attacked on October 7th, 2023? When Sinwar, the person who actually took the decision to attack on October 7th, came to power in 2017, he was the number one person in Gaza. But before he engaged in this attack, he tried everything, because we have to understand that Gaza was under siege since 2007. So by that time, it's been 16 years. Nothing in, nothing out is allowed in Gaza, and the Israelis always tell the people that they are mowing the lawn and they will only allow certain amount of calories to go to every Palestinian. Every single thing that is of value was denied the Palestinians. The Palestinians were even not allowed to travel in or out. All kinds of crippling siege was imposed on Gaza. And Sinwar tried to say, okay, what is the problem? Well, you're not recognizing this. You're not abiding by this. It's okay. They said you have to leave the governance of Gaza. So he offered Abbas. He said, come and take the keys under one condition and one condition only. And he did that in 2017 and 2018. You take the keys of Gaza, come rule Gaza. If the siege is lifted, we know that the Israelis never allowed this to take place. We know that the Europeans and the Americans applied all kinds of pressure on Abbas not to accept this offer, even though he was very much willing to do that. And then came the Great March of Return in 2018, trying to put pressure, peaceful measures, people going to the fence and talking that we need to return to our lands, we need to lift the siege, do something, oh world. The world was just watching, and with complete absence of any kind of empathy or sympathy or any kind of action. 230 Palestinians were killed during that time, thousands of people injured, and nothing was done. And these are peaceful marches with nothing whatsoever to show in terms of force. He went to the Egyptians asking for mediation. He said, I'm willing to offer 10-year truce, 15-year truce, whatever it takes. One condition only, lift the siege. They never even entertained any of these ideas. So when you look at all the different things, diplomacy, the offer to abdicate, the offer to leave the governance of Gaza, the offer to truce, the offer to engage, talking to the world, none of these were accepted. The only thing that was complete surrender, and even complete surrender that was given by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, did not stop a single settlement from being constructed or a single settler from trying to burn the fields or trying to go after the Palestinians in Area C or Area B or sometimes even Area A. So when you look at Gaza and this siege, that certainly was a very frustrating situation. We look at the West Bank. Again, the West Bank, we talked about the settlements, the settlers, the encroachment, the confiscations of land, and eventually this idea of annexation, which this current government in 2023 was talking about, and we saw that this was the actual plan. It was not a dream. It was an actual plan put into action. and they were coming day in and day out by the even Likud members as well as the other right-wing extremist groups. When you look at Jerusalem, Jerusalem was being we saw the different settlers attacking Jerusalem. They were coming to storm the sacred places, the compound, first every month, then even sometimes weekly, and they come under whatever the feast or whatever the day is in order to declare that this is a Jewish sacred places, that they will try to impose what they call division in time and space, that they are going to actually come and take over. All kinds of provocations were taking place, which was another thing. That's why it's called Tufan al-Aqsa, because al-Aqsa is a very important symbol in the struggle. And we saw this before in 2021, in May 2021. And then add to this the prisoners. You know, the Smotrich came to be in charge of the West Bank, so he was imposing all these kind of settlements and settlers and construction and all kinds of restrictions. But we could also see in terms of the prisoners who were under the command and authority of Itamar bin Gvir, this the so-called Minister of National Police or National Security, and then he came swearing that he will make prison as nightmare to Palestinian prisoners. All the things that they have won throughout the decades, in terms of the right to education, the right to visitation, the right to cook, the right to pray together, the right to have all kinds of programs within the prison system. All these things were taken away from them, and they were crying. They were basically calling on Sinwar to do something about these things. These are things that we have won, and he's trying to make their life miserable within the prison system. Add to that the hundreds, and I think the number was close to 2,000 people who were under administrative detention, who were never charged with anything, and now we could see them that they were also living in difficult situations. But the most important, of course, reason is the geopolitical aspect of this, because we saw 15 days before Tufan al-Aqsa how Netanyahu stood before the United Nations when he gave a speech on September 22nd, 2023, and he was touting how he's going to, he was actually drawing a map that started from India, going through the Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Oman, the Arabian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, to Haifa, from there through the Mediterranean to Europe, and calling this the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, that this is going to be the future. Israel is going to be a prominent role. There was no Palestine there. He basically was trying to tell the whole people that this is a situation where Israel is going to rule and be the hegemon in this area against its enemies, meaning, of course, Iran and the axis of resistance, which includes Hamas and the Palestinian resistance movements in general. And we could see that this was a threat that is being implemented because the United States, in its with its rivalry with China, it wanted to actually have less footprint and go and concentrate and focus on China and freeze out China and try to complete the normalization process, which we know now through the many testimonies of Brett McGarrick and others, that they were planning for the spring of 2024. So this is a situation, had it taken place, Saudi Arabia didn't want to do it alone, so it was dragging Pakistan and Indonesia. Had these three countries normalized with Israel, that would be the end of the Palestinian issue. So there had something to be done. Israel was not giving Palestinians anything. The Palestinian Authority, in a total state of weakness, of impotence, it cannot do anything, change anything. The Arab regimes basically have moved on with the Abrahamic Accords, and the Palestinians have to do something about their plight, about their future. And Hamas thought of itself as that power that could actually change the equation, even if the odds were against it. Because sometimes you do things for rational reasons, knowing fully well that the consequences could be devastating, because you are desperate and you are trying to change the equations, hoping that things would be different. And my final point here is that it would have been extremely difficult for Hamas to have anticipated the consequences for many reasons. The history of the conflict tells us that when Hamas or the Palestinians have a military battle or a military engagement with Israel, usually it takes a few days or a few weeks, but we never had that situation before. It doesn't mean that it could not have happened, but the experience of that struggle never had this kind of viciousness, this kind of basically genocide taking place day in and day out, where the whole rules of engagement have changed to the point that this right-wing government actually was contemplating mass exodus, mass exile, mass murder of the Palestinians in Gaza. It would have been very difficult for those who planned this, because I can tell you from everything I read that they never contemplated that this could go on that. It doesn't mean whether it's right or wrong. It's just in the history of the conflict, we didn't do it. But also, or the Sword of Jerusalem, in which the West Bank had an uprising. The 1948 had an uprising. The whole Muslim world had an uprising. So for them, they thought that this would also engender the same kind of reaction. But of course, we didn't see that. So it would have also been difficult not to foresee that the West Bank would move and the 1948 areas would move, and then the Muslim world would move, including governments, which it didn't happen. It didn't happen, even though you had the mass demonstrations around the world, but these were mostly in different non-Muslim societies, a few here and there in Muslim societies, but mainly in non-Muslim societies, which really made Israeli reputation, it's in the gutter now. I mean, no one respects or even believes in the Israeli narrative, and this is it's a sea change in terms of the narrative and the nature of the conflict. But those who contemplated the attack on October 7th, 2023, would not have thought that all these things would come together. There will be this massive revenge and retribution and genocide and without any rules, that there will be, in addition to that, a massive support from the West. There will be absolutely no pressure on the Zionist regime from the United States, from Europe, that they will have free hand completely. They will be given all the things they need in terms of armaments, in terms of political support, political protection, shield, and so on and so forth. The major letdown by the Arab regimes and by the masses, frankly, and even the movements around. And of course, this came after the failure of the so-called Arab Spring and revolutions. So we live in a different era than happened, let's say, 10, 15 years ago. And then you have, in addition to all this, obviously, the situation with the international community that was unable, to do anything, not only during Biden, but particularly also during Trump, where Trump completely ignored all sense of international law, international rules, and international community, and so on and so forth. The bottom line is that Hamas is an indigenous movement within the Palestinian community. It has been leading the effort to stand up to the occupation, to the oppression and tyranny and suppression and mass murder of the Israeli soldiers and the Israeli onslaught. It tried throughout its history to reach some kind of an accommodation in order to make a difference, only to be faced with these rejections and also with violence. So when we try to evaluate this period, certainly 10 minutes or 15 minutes is not enough to get every aspect of it. But I wanted to address these two questions in particular to let people understand that the Palestinian resistance movement has taken different phases. At one point before 1948, it was one phase, and we can certainly, whoever is interested, we can talk about that. And then it was another phase, but there was a huge gap because of the trauma of the Nakba. And then there was the rise of the Palestinian national movement in the late 50s that stayed almost up until 1982, with the disbursement of the soldiers who were from Beirut to different Arab countries, and that was the start of the rise of the movements within the occupied territories led by Hamas. And Hamas certainly was an indigenous movement trying to end the occupation and end the oppression on the Palestinian people. And then that led us, of course, eventually to what we have witnessed. And if you look at the question whether these things had rationality, whether these were rational reasons, certainly they were rational reasons. Whether or not they were correct, a correct decision, I can answer that, but I don't have time to do that. That would be a different question from whether or not it was a rational decision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Arian. I think that kind of enlightened thinking and analysis is something that we've really been deprived of the last 3 years in this country because of the terrorism legislation, because of the breadth of understanding of what expressing support means. And most journalists, most commentators, most lawyers, activists would prefer just to pretend this discussion doesn't need to take place at all. I think we really appreciate you sharing that analysis and those words of wisdom with us. I'm sure, I mean, I learned a lot. I'm sure many others have as well. Our next speaker is someone who's lived in Gaza for the most of his life, Abu Bakr Abid, a sports journalist who, due to circumstances, had to turn into a war correspondent before having to leave Gaza just last year. Abu Bakr joins us from Dublin, and he's going to be giving us an insight into what life was like in Gaza, living under the Hamas administration.
Thanks so much for having me, and for all the people here in this discussion. I think first and foremost, I just want to make clear that, of course, I don't speak on behalf of the 2 million people in Gaza. This is first and foremost. And second, my experience would be focused on the genocide, because when Hamas took control or was elected into power in 2006, I was 4 years old. And at the same time, the thing about this, that definitely there are conflicting views of Hamas within the Gaza Strip. It's also very important to know that I think one very significant point that people need to understand is not to confine the armed resistance to Hamas. And Hamas, as Dr. Azzam said, which was true and was proved to be true, that they never intended in genuinely ruling the Gaza Strip since its foundation, but then it was elected into power, and then it democratically won the elections. However, there are people at the time, because I've also spoken to journalists and doctors and residents and other categories of the population during the 3 years of genocide before that, and even before this event. And I think on the very latest development, I would agree that Hamas, with Hamas dissolution of its government and emergency committee, the relief of the Palestinians, unfortunately, the crippling widespread sanctions that have been placed on Hamas since it came into power in 2006, and the blockade that Fahd has mentioned, have made things impossible with the genocide that Hamas could stay in power and effectively and rightly rule the Gaza Strip. And no one is ready to come and help them in any way possible. Everyone is surging away from them, is going actually against them, is participating in the genocide against the Palestinians for the past 3 years, from the very, very close nations, neighboring countries, to the very far ones in the West. So this is very important to know. And many people believe that, and I think I would agree to some extent on that, that there was miscalculation and misreading of the neighboring countries by Hamas before the October 7th attacks. And by that, I mean there are a lot of people in Gaza who are astonished by the vision of Hamas, how they see, or they still envision some kind of support that would come from Arab countries, when we know that Arab countries have military bases from which American fighter jets go to Israel and supply weapons to kill Palestinians, which has been widely reported. Qatar has done that. Saudi Arabia, all these Arab countries, the United Arab Emirates, has also supported the Israel-backed militias east of the so-called Yellow Line, which has added more misery and suffering to the Palestinians. So I talked earlier to Dr. Azzdin Shaheen, who's an emergency doctor and also a very politically aware person in the Gaza Strip. And the point that he has seen is that the situation in Gaza has become utterly unbearable, and by that he means that Hamas was negotiating over the course of the entire genocide on things that he saw if Hamas conceded or gave up, that the situation would have been a lot better. And sadly, there was no approval of any Hamas amendments to the ceasefire negotiations or talks since they took place back in November 2023 when the first truce happened, and no one never agreed with Hamas on anything. So Hamas had to give concessions. And we also know that Hamas, 1 week after October the 7th, they offered to give all the so-called Israeli civilian hostages to Israel in return for not entering the Strip, which Israel refused. So the equation of clashes with Israel, or clash or fighting with Israel, was kind of pended by the October 7th attacks, which many people in Gaza didn't see as a necessity. And things were absolutely better before October the 7th. And just to draw a line of comparison here, which is really very important, that before October the 7th, life for people in Gaza was better. But to put it into an analogy, it's like someone who was blind, but he had an eye to see, but after October the 7th, he's completely blind. That's the actual situation of the Gaza Strip after what has happened so far. So a lot of people with what I see, like in the West and around, okay, they want Hamas to stay in power. I think one of the reasons why Hamas stayed in power is because it embraced the resistance vision, which a lot of people do approve of. And I think that's why it's still the most favorable party, according to the Jerusalem Media and Communication Center polls that were conducted in 2025. Hamas is still favorable by 40% of the population in Gaza. The other parties' favorability pales in comparison with Hamas, which is understandable. Of course, the Oslo Accords was the worst trajectory of events in the Palestinian cause history. People disapproved of Fatah for what it's and the Palestinian Authority for what it does in the occupied West Bank. But still, if we look at what has happened in the response from Arab countries, even from the populations, if people wanted for Hamas to stay in power, there was no support. And back to the point that I just mentioned, Hamas promotion to power made everyone working in civic sectors or civil sectors a legitimate target, because Israel deliberately conflated between Hamas as a governing or ruling party and the armed resistance groups. Because if we are saying that Hamas is the armed resistance, we're historically and categorically wrong, because of course Hamas didn't come up with the armed resistance vision and its own. There were other resistance groups that were created before Hamas. Palestinians were always resisting before Hamas as well. And I think what is important to know is that Hamas promotion to power again, many people view it as a wrong move, as miscalculation, and this was clear by the sanctions by the United States and the draconian consequences that have happened to Hamas from the neighboring countries and others. And there was a lot of pressure on Hamas in many times. And during its 20 years rule of Gaza. But it's also because the armed resistance is not just the Al-Qassam brigades. No, it's not. It's also Sarai al-Quds. It's also Alwiyat al-Nasr, it's also other armed resistance groups. There are also, because I was in Gaza and I lived 19 months of the genocide, there were also ordinary citizens who fought against the Israeli military in Gaza, and that was reported during the massacre, Nusayrat massacre, in which 4 so-called Israeli hostages were rescued and 210 Palestinians were killed. So it's really monumentally important to understand these differences. And if you read in Muhammad Hamid, he's one of the famous commanders in armed resistance in Gaza, and he also wrote a book called Under the Flag of the Flood. And in his book, he also alluded to some criticisms of Hamas, which he saw during his fighting in Gaza until he fell in battle in 2024 in July. So the idea that everyone who is enlisted in the armed resistance groups do align with the ideology of the political groups is actually wrong, and historically wrong from an experience. And that is something that Western audiences, Western regimes and Arab regimes have imposed or have brainwashed people by, that, well, Hamas started October the 7th. Well, Hamas is a political group, but the ones who, Hamas led to October the 7th attacks, but at the same time, we just can't, like Sarai al-Quds went in, other ordinary citizens went in, and all of that happened. So the idea that we are conflating between the armed resistance and Hamas, which West wants, is in fact, or was in fact placed to delegitimize the armed resistance. You wouldn't see in any Western media outlet or any Western politician saying or referring to any armed resistance group as armed resistance, but he would rather say, or they would rather say, well, Hamas did this, Fatah did this, and that did this. And by that, I have to admit it, which is really hurtful, that they succeeded in eliminating the armed resistance, or the legitimacy of the armed resistance within Gaza and across Palestine. Now, for people, as in when it comes to how Hamas ended its control, of course, Hamas is not a perfect ruling party. It had its own mistakes. Of course, it had its own positives and negatives. A lot of people, even before October the 7th and after October the 7th, there are supporters of the group within Gaza. There are opponents of the group within Gaza, which is understandable. But there are a lot of wrong narratives that have been circulating against Hamas, that it's eliminating its dissent, which is not factually right, because we saw Fatah and the Palestinian Authority operating within Gaza in civil sectors and beyond. We saw the Fatah group organizing movements and organizing sessions in support of their own political party. And Hamas oppresses women, whatever. This was absolutely not right. Women had the freedom to do whatever they wanted. They had the freedom to wear whatever they wanted. So all this propaganda that the West has been pushing is completely wrong. And moreover, Hamas, of course, it says, or its charter says, it's an Islamic movement. Of course, it doesn't just go with being very extreme or hardline, as some people would say. It would follow the Islamic traditions and rules and Sharia law to a great extent, but of course, it fell short on many aspects, which I myself have seen. I think at this time, people in Gaza are quite different. Would they want to see a similar situation or a microcosm of the West Bank in Gaza or not? That is the question at the moment. And at the moment, a lot of people in Gaza don't see, if Hamas stays in power, that there would be concessions from the Americans or the Arabs or even the mediators in these negotiations that are happening at the moment. So they are, I think the vast majority, from what I've heard, from the people that I've heard, the vast majority of the people that I talked to, they were quite relieved that Hamas just disbanded its government. And I think they want an alternative, but a Palestinian-led alternative. They don't approve of, I think a lot of people don't approve of the Trump so-called board of peace. They want a completely Palestinian-led ruling party. When it comes to Fatah, some people would approve of Fatah to come in because Fatah diplomatically is approved by Western regimes and Arab regimes, and it also has the funding. But also, to be fair to the Palestinian Authority, despite everything that is happening, also the Palestinian Authority is funding so many workers within Gaza, and they give them salaries every month. And that is something that is, of course, one of the things that is important to consider when we're talking about the government of Gaza. So as I just said, like a lot of people, it's very hard to give a rate of what Hamas rule has been over the past 20 years. The crippling widespread sanctions do make a difference, do play a role in that. The disapproval of Hamas and the designation of Hamas as a proscribed organization by the UK and most Western regimes has also made things very difficult, complicated, and cumbersome for them to operate freely. From what I've seen in the past, like in my lifetime, from what I've heard of people, Hamas didn't have the latitude that Fatah had. I think if there were no siege and if there were no crippling widespread sanctions, financial and political sanctions, we would have talked differently here on what Hamas could have done in Gaza. So at the time, I'm right now in as I said, like in Ireland. I'm sadly from the Palestinian diaspora. I really wish I stayed in Gaza. Of course, I haven't ever, just to be clear, haven't ever joined a political group in Gaza. I haven't been with any of them. I'd love to see, which a lot of people would say, a united Palestinian body from every faction. We would love to see unity. The split between Fatah and Hamas has caused a lot of problems in Gaza. It has also caused a lot of bloodshed. And nobody would have loved to see that. But in the end, either it's Hamas or Fatah, for me personally, what I've seen during the past 3 years, I think, as I just said, like there were political statements from some of the Hamas leaders that I found, to be honest, astonishing. I don't know how they made it. And I remember some of the statements, just to be clear, so people are not numb about it. They were sometimes exaggerating about the capabilities of the armed resistance in front of Israel, which is backed by Western regimes and which is the most sophisticated army in West Asia, when I say the Middle East. So there was sometimes like we were ready for a war of attrition, whatever. I think that was a little bit of illogical fact to say by some of the political leaders, especially the leaders outside. Also, a lot would argue in Gaza that Hamas didn't listen to its people a lot of the time, which I would absolutely agree to some extent. And I think there was another political statement that I was in Gaza when it was made by Khalid Mish'al, another political leader, when he said that the civilian population was a technical loss. And I found this irresponsible, as many in Gaza would be or were infuriated by. So there have to be improvements. And as I just said, of course, Hamas is flawed. A lot of people they are idealizing Hamas, heroizing Hamas. And I really want to clarify something. I don't want this to be hijacked or manipulated by some Western audiences or something. This is something unprecedented that I do, and I do after 3 years of the genocide, because we're at a very critical time. The fact that we criticize Hamas doesn't mean that, we are agreeing with Israel. That's something, of course, hasn't happened or doesn't happen. What we want to see is Palestinians, and as I just said again, I don't speak on behalf of the Palestinians. I just said some of the things that people want to see. People want to see a ruling party that would allow relief aid and things to get back on track for Gazans and for Palestinians. You would imagine we can't sit in the most opulent, comfortable places in the West and just dictate to people in Gaza which political party they should choose. And most importantly, the matter of Hamas or Fatah or any political party is not for anyone, even Palestinian, with respect to Dr. Sam and Dr. Azam, to decide. This is up to the Palestinians in Gaza. This is their future. This is up to the families in Gaza who have borne the unbearable during the past 3 years. But the fact is, as I said again, there are mistakes within the organization. There have been some things which they did, and I found this to be like off the charter, against the charter. And one of the things that I would believe Hamas would improve on is to connect the people, to connect with the people in Gaza. There was sometimes, like, there was, of course, any political party would prefer itself over the others. The sons of this political party would be preferred over the others, which is understandable, but also still lacks some transparency and justice. So this does actually happen. If we look at the other parties, as I just said, the favorability is different. A lot of people want to see a change. A lot of people want to see relief coming into Gaza. But if we are here talking about Hamas to continue, I don't think by the dissolution of Hamas, the armed resistance vision would end. Because what we are talking about right now, 70% of Gaza is occupied. 90% of the Gaza Strip is obliterated, is blown up to smithereens. People are living in tents under the heat, under a lot of things that are happening. So the thing about all of this is that people, after 3 years, there has been an unbelievable failure and inaction by Western populations, most importantly Arab populations, in doing something and urging their governments to actually stop the genocide. I would also comment on others. I think Iran should have done better in dealing with in supporting the armed resistance groups in Gaza. I know it's the only country that supported the armed resistance groups. I think there are a lot of things that I can talk about here, and definitely can't be covered in 10 to 15 minutes. It's really, as I said, essential to understand all these differences and why some of the people were infuriated or irritated by how Hamas ruled the Gaza Strip. You mentioned one point that I would comment on very importantly, Fahad. I think it's very important to know that Hamas allowed the Palestinian Authority to operate in Gaza and to run many civil sectors in Gaza. Hamas didn't eliminate the Palestinian Authority, but also simultaneously, Hamas was clear since its formation conference in 2006 by Ismail Haniyeh that, well, our aim is to build the needed and necessary military infrastructure to resist the occupation and liberate Palestine. However, Hamas and other political factions in Gaza have made concessions, most notably in 2015. They made an appeal to the European Union and the international community that they would stop all the military activities, which was reported by Israeli media in 2015. And they made these concessions and said, well, we're going to stop all the military activities underground and on the ground in return for a seaport, an airport, and lifting of the blockade. Israel refused that. The international community didn't give a bother about it. I think what Hamas faced, Hamas tried everything. And I believe after all these years that the capabilities of the armed resistance in Gaza are unable to liberate Palestine. We have to be very logical about this at the moment. And also the peaceful protest, the West doesn't give a monkeys about it. The Arab countries, like what I would say, I wouldn't generalize, of course, but I think from the leaders and Arab regimes leaders, just yesterday, the Bahraini so-called king had a call with the president of Israel. She led the genocide, and it's normal. They're now aiming at normalizing with Saudi Arabia, and I think that's getting even harder and harder and harder. There is, like as I just said, a lot of people would question Hamas where they saw the hope in so-called Arab and Muslim countries in coming to their rescue. That's the most important question that a lot of people would ask themselves. Now, the capabilities of the armed resistance before 2023 was a logical part of the clash equation that terrorist settlers would never get into Gaza because they know they would be repelled. Israel tried some of the special, like deployed some of the, or dispatched some of the special forces. Most notably, Nuruddin Baraka was killed in one of these operations to go and assassinate some of the armed resistance leaders. They were also repelled. So when Israel was striking Gaza, Gaza was striking back by some of the rockets by the armed resistance groups. So I just want to make clear finally that when we are talking about Hamas and the armed resistance, just want people to understand, I want people not to undermine or write off the efforts of other armed resistance groups. Now, Hamas is out of the equation. Does that mean that armed resistance has vanished? Of course, no. The armed resistance groups are different, and the political groups are also different. Of course, there's a little bit of connection, but not to the level that the West is trying to lecture people about, which is of course wrong. But as I said again, there are conflicting views. The polls show that Hamas is self-favorable, but in the end, it's up to the Palestinians to decide. We want to see a unity among parties. We want to see a better life for the Palestinians. That's up to them. And I think Western audiences and Arab audiences have to listen to what the Palestinians in Gaza want to see in the territory. That is what is important. If you want to support the means, because I think Gaza has thrown the kitchen sink at it, and it hasn't worked out so far. So if you want to support Gaza, either peacefully, either violently through the armed resistance, which is not violent, of course, through the armed resistance, then we should stand up to these standards. But we can't just, pull out of all of this and just give sloganeering, and that's what it is. So this is, I think, the most important point that people would understand. Of course, the vast majority of the population would say, well, we are with the armed resistance. People would love to see that. Of course, the pictures of Israeli soldiers being humiliated is much more upbeat and hopeful and encouraging for people to see than living under their brutality and subjugation like in the West Bank. But if we want to keep that running, then there has to be another equation, which is you want to give these proscribed parties some legitimacy. You want to go to courts and deprescribe them and do all of that. You want to enhance their capabilities and their administrative power by lifting the blockade and doing all of this, which is not going to happen, because even before October the 7th, 150,000 people were working in the occupied territories within Israeli companies. That was refreshing and instrumental and very important and significant to the economy of the Palestinian sectors within Gaza and in the West Bank. But now things are very difficult. The West Bank is being shrunk, Gaza is being shrunk, and we're not seeing a response. We're not seeing a response at all. And some people would argue, just the one final point, like, we have nothing to do with Gaza. I think we're not doing anything. First, we're Muslims. Second, your taxes are directly contributing to the plight of the Palestinians that have been going on for many, many, many years. So it's your duty to support what the Palestinians want. And of course, I believe what the Palestinians want is a united body, one of their own choice, not one that people would dictate to them. They would have, of course, we don't want a so-called board of peace to rule Gaza according to the American standards. And we've seen in the West a lot of the things. So in the end, just support what the Palestinians want.
Thank you very much, Abu Bakr, for that really first-hand account, which a lot of us would not be familiar with. Again, it's these types of discussions which we've been deprived of, because people just don't want to have the discussion. So it's been really, really helpful hearing from you. A lot of what you said, actually, because you're in Ireland at the moment, so you can probably ask around Dublin, and I grew up in Ireland. What you mentioned about sort of the reaction from the public towards Hamas in the wake of the 7th of October and Tufan al-Aqsa is very reminiscent of the reaction that the Irish people had towards the Easter Rising in 1916, and how the revolutionaries were dragged through the streets by the Brits, and Irish people who were living under occupation were spitting on these rebels, throwing stuff at them, throwing garbage at them, because again, it was seen that what were you doing turning up with some small rifles to take on the British Empire, while Irish soldiers serving in the British Army in the World War, and all sorts of issues happened and repression. And then, strangely, it's due to the repression of Britain on generally Irish people and Catholics at that time that the tide changed, the mood shifted. I think people later recognized that the sacrifice brought a lot of short-term repression, but in the long term, it was almost needed to spark something that would later lead to the War of Independence. So I think this happens. Obviously, what happened in Ireland is not to the scale of what's happening in Gaza, but again, it reminded me of that incident. We've got a lot of questions in the chat box as well. I just want to ask Dr. Azam, Abu Bakr so alluded to the fact that Hamas is no longer in the equation. And again, that could be interpreted in two ways, I guess, as part of the resistance or as part of governance. But what role do you see for Hamas? I mean, you mentioned yourself that Hamas didn't seek governance; it almost had it thrust upon them in one sense. But where do you think, in your opinion? I mean, you've known the movement for decades. Where do you see them moving at this, going back to being just a resistance group, or will they be, for example, contesting the next election?
Well, who knows whether there will be another election or not? I mean, it's really difficult to tell. Hamas is not the Palestinian issue. Hamas is a project. A certain segment of the Palestinian people undertook because at a certain stage in the history of these people and the history of their cause, it seemed that nothing was working. And these were the circumstances in 1987 that led to the transformation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a social movement, social religious movement, transforming itself into a resistance movement. So Hamas could go, and some other actor will come. I mean, there was one day when I grew up, Fatah was our movement. We thought of Fatah as being our national liberation movement, and today Fatah is associated with treason, regrettably. I mean, look at what happened. Yasser Arafat at one time was our hero, and then he ended up giving up on our cause. At least in the case of Hamas, there was no capitulation. There was no giving up on the principles. It might have been militarily defeated, but the idea is still there. Maybe a new generation will come and carry it forward. You see, what is important, at least this is for me, this is how I see the Palestinian, well, I shouldn't say a Palestinian question, because to me it's not really a Palestinian question. This is how I see what goes on in that part of the world. The Palestinians, being the immediate victims of Zionism, are in a lot of pain. They bear much of the cost of the struggle against Zionism. But Zionism as a project is not targeted at the Palestinians. It's targeted at the Ummah as a whole. And therefore, I prefer to always look at this as being the struggle of the Ummah, even if the Ummah is not up to it, even if the Ummah is not yet in the right shape, even if the Ummah is in need of a lot of work to be really involved. But we are talking here about the Ummah as a whole being targeted by a colonial settler campaign whose primary objective is to keep this ummah under control, to keep it paralyzed, to keep it backward, so that the colonial powers who created Israel in the first place continue to do whatever they want. And therefore, whatever sacrifices the Palestinians are doing, in whatever name, in whatever shape, that's their destiny. But eventually, this is an ummatic cause. This is the cause for the ummah as a whole. So I don't just expect from our brothers and sisters, our fellow human beings who believe in justice and freedom, to just sympathize with the Palestinians. No, they need to be involved. This is the struggle for every one of us, even for the non-Muslims, even people who are not considered to be part of the ummah. If they believe in humanity, Zionism is against humanity, and this is how we need to talk about this conflict. My grandfather was in the resistance. My father was in the resistance. People from my generation were in the resistance. My people from the generation of my children and grandchildren and those who will come after them will always, some of them will always be part of this project, because that's our destiny as Palestinians, people born in Palestine. But this is not a Palestinian issue. This is a much, much bigger and more complicated issue.
Thank you, Dr. Tamimi. Professor Arian, there's been a few questions coming in about the role of other powers in the region like Turkey and Iran. This really goes back to your sort of expertise and what you've been analyzing and studying for a very long time now. Do you believe that, I mean, one question has arisen is whether Iran will include Gaza in its sort of memorandum and as a negotiating item with the Americans? That's number one. And secondly, does Hamas dissolving their government structure weaken their geopolitical alliances, or does it sort of untie their hands regionally and give them more carte blanche to do what they want to do?
Well, the answer to Iran, it's not going to include Gaza, and for a good reason. This is I know, of course, they can, but the end result is nothing's going to happen, because America basically has set out the future of Gaza. All the players and the stakeholders have accepted the American plan, unfortunately, particularly the Arab and Muslim countries. We've seen when Trump came with his fantasy idea of this board of peace, which has nothing to do with peace, there was an alternative plan that the Russians put out. It was based on the French-Saudi plan, which is a two-state solution. That's come and gone for a long time, but nevertheless, it was the thing. And then Trump shifted everybody's and deviated attention to this board of peace idea. And then the Russians came and put this in the center, and then everybody voted with Trump. And fortunately, most of the region, particularly the Arab and Muslim countries, have been cheering this thing. So there's not going to be much progress, I'm afraid, with Gaza. This whole thing about elections is another illusion. People under occupation, elections mean nothing. This thing about what is the governance of Hamas is really a farce. What governance? Hamas is not a sovereign country. Palestine is not a sovereign country. Palestinian Authority is not a sovereign country. They don't have independence. So this notion that somehow they have to be governing themselves, and we're going to hold elections, these are all pie in the skies that really mean nothing. And I know that different players would like to play the role that somehow Palestinians have agency and the Palestinians have voted, and we've seen now that the Palestinians are voting and they are bringing in their representatives. Absolute nonsense. We know that experiment when even it was on a small scale. What happened in 2006, as you said, Carter was there and everybody else, where the Palestinians allowed actually to have their own representatives and to rule. No, those people who were elected, what happened to them? They were picked out one by Israel and put in jail. Are the Palestinians who are actually even working with and submitted to every condition that the West and the United States and the Quartet and the United Nations and the European Union and so on and so forth have adhered to, they are on the verge of collapse. Every single condition that was imposed on the Palestinians, they agreed to it, whether it is financial, whether it is economic, whether it's political, whether it is military, whether it's, truncated state, the non-militarized state, every single thing has been submitted to. Nothing is happening. This, as Dr. Azam says, we're facing a settler, colonial, racist, supremacist movement that is intent on pursuing its project. And therefore, any notion that somehow there is a silver bullet, that somehow just if the Palestinians unite themselves, what are we talking about? There has never been unity in resistance. Most struggles around the world, they always have factions, different factions within the occupied, because the occupied is the weakest part. And they know how to divide them, and or somehow, if Hamas and Fatah come together, yes, we could be stronger, but it's not going to make a huge difference. We have to understand the nature of the struggle, and I would like to talk about that for a minute. As the brother said, this is not a Palestinian problem. The way I would redefine it, it's an Israeli problem. When I say to people, you have to shift your paradigm, you have to shift your understanding. Once we say a Palestinian problem, then the Palestinians are the victims, the Palestinians are in struggle. My role is to support them, to make dua, to make donations, to help them in any way, shape, or form. That is not the nature of the conflict. It is an Israeli problem, and Israel is a threat to every single nation, every single community, even beyond the region. This is a threat to everybody because they're trying to rewrite and they're trying to impose total control and hegemony over everyone. And when I tell people Palestine should be the central issue, oh, you're saying, why are you saying this? The suffering of the Syrians were more than the suffering of the Palestinians. I said, it's not about suffering. I acknowledge that the suffering of the Afghanis, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Libyans, the Sudanese, the Somalis, the Yemenis could be more than the Palestinians, minus the genocide, of course. But this is not about the suffering. It's not even about the sacredness and the holy places in Palestine. The reason Palestine is the central issue, or should be the central issue of the Ummah and all movements and currents and parties, is because of the nature of the enemy. That enemy is beyond any other thing. So don't compare the suffering of this country or that country with the suffering of the Palestinians and conclude, okay, we suffered more. And no, it's about you had a local problem. That local problem could be solved here and there. What we have here is a problem that's facing everybody. Israel will never allow any country in this region or any community in this region to have a civilizational project, to have an advancement in science, to have economic prosperity, to have democracy, to have unity, to have any kind of thing, because in its understanding, in its ideology, in its practice, in its behavior, unless it is the total hegemon in this region and knocks down every other source of power, it will be in danger. And then you can basically, explain everything that happened to this ummah. I'm not saying that it's exclusively Israel, but Israel plays a huge role. Do you know that there was a unit within the Mossad and a unit within the Israeli Foreign Ministry since 1957? Do you know what its aim was? How to break up Sudan. So in 2010, when it happened, the president of South Sudan went to his first trip to Israel on the tarmac. While Netanyahu is receiving him, he said, if there was any person who should be credited with our independence, it is this person. This person was the station chief, the Mossad station chief in Juba for many years. So they will not rest until they break up every single country. They break up Iraq into 3. They break up Syria into 4. They break up Lebanon. They break up Egypt. They break Libya. They break Yemen. I mean, that's how. This is not a fantasy. I'm not making this up. It is written down in black and white in many documents, even Sharon himself gave a speech in 1983, a speech which I translated back in 1984. He gave to the NATO, saying that the only solution for this region is for minorities and for ethnicities to have their own independence. They want a Kurdish state, they want a Druze state, they want an Alawite state, they want a Sunni state, they want a Shia state, they want a Maghizi state. Why? Because that's how they can actually control the region. How could 7 million people control 400 million? They can't. But if we can make these 400 million into 100 communities, each one 4 or 5 million, very weak and never able to defend themselves, then Israel becomes the hegemon. This is what we're facing. And if we had any doubts, I think now this should be very, very clear. This is how we should be understanding this situation. If you look at the Baluchistan, the problem in Baluchistan, I can guarantee you there is an Israeli hand there to break up Pakistan. There is an attempt also to weaken Turkey. A lot of people within the Israeli regime, the Zionist regime, talking about how Turkey is the next threat. Iran, look at what's doing. The whole economy of the world now is at the brink. Why? Because Netanyahu, who's over 30 years, was not able to convince American presidents. Now he found a partner in his crime, a partner, someone who's not very smart, someone who can easily be deluded. And he started this war against Iran. And what's the conclusion? Is that the whole economy, the world economy, could be in peril. We could be facing something that's never been faced before. But we can look also at the other side. If Iran wins, then we're talking about possibly the Suez moment, the end of the British Empire in 1956, when they were defeated, even though militarily they overcame Egypt. But at the end, they had to withdraw from the whole region. We could be facing this moment. If America withdraws from this moment, then we can look at the weakening of the Israeli hegemony in this region. We can talk about also that there is reconsolidation of those who refuse to admit and to submit to foreign hegemony, to foreign influence. That we can get back all those forces who would like to truly be independent. They would try to resist this hegemonic attack on the region. And I think this is a moment, this is an opportunity actually, that could present itself, that the Tawfan, with all the sacrifices, with all the suffering that we have seen, have rechanged, have recalibrated, have designed this whole region, because they actually tried to redesign this region in a way that they can have total control, and it backfired on them. And I think we can talk about that, obviously, with all the signs that take place. But first things first, what we need as Palestinians, more than elections, and to me, Palestinian Authority is dead. Palestinian Authority is better, actually, if it is dismantled and uniting the Palestinians under occupation to have real resistance to the old sources of their suffering, rather than having this semblance of somehow we have a process that could lead to something that's never going to lead to anything. The purpose of resistance, and let me say that very plainly, the purpose of resistance and the purpose of all groups in the occupied territories, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, everywhere, is to make sure Palestinians stay on their land, that they don't leave. This is the primary source. It's not to liberate Palestine. Liberating Palestine comes from weakening the sources of power and strength of the Zionist enemy, of the Zionist movement, of the Zionist regime. That means we have to identify what kind of pillars, what kind of foundations this regime depend on. And we could see, I in my studies, I identified 12 different pillars in which they stand on. And then we have to understand these pillars and see how we weaken them. That means we have to build a global movement, because Zionist influence does not stop in Palestine. Zionist influence, and the reason that they are capable of mobilizing the whole world for their cause. We saw it during the genocide. During the genocide, you had 57 Muslim countries meeting twice, November 11, 2023, November 11, a year later, 2024, they were not able to make a difference. They couldn't even, on the one thing they agreed on, they couldn't even deliver 1 cup of water to a thirsty child unless Netanyahu said so. So that means we're not independent. That's the only explanation, that we are not sovereign. So that means we have to fight Zionist influence, foreign influence in every society. To do that, we have to know their sources of strength. When we do that, then we start crumbling this house. I tell people, think of Israel as a house that is built on 12 pillars. For that evilness that has been the source of all these wars and suffering, that needs to go. That has nothing to do with Jews, by the way, because our fight is not with Jews. It's with aggression, with Zionists, with those who would like to impose their will on the whole region, who would like to impose and make the Palestinians basically slaves in their own land. That's what we're facing. And therefore, we have to think of bigger projects. We have to build a global movement. I saw many questions said, what do we do? How do we know? Everybody is part to this struggle. The Palestinians are the first victims, but they're not the only victims. The Palestinians, the problem with Zionism actually has been that they were not able to even overcome their victims. Have Palestinians submitted and have gone away, they would have gone to the next piece of land and to the next community, but they weren't able to do that. And what Palestinians need to do is, yes, they need to have all the support that they can get in order to remain on their land and to remain steadfast and resilient and resistant. But we can't ask them for more than that. And all the resistance movements, as the brothers both said before, even if you eradicate one, another one will be created, because the root of the problem has not been dealt with. So Hamas today represents the resistance of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people embrace resistance movements. They don't go about bashing them. They don't go about attacking them. Yes, people make mistakes, as in any movement. But the point here, it's what's the purpose of the movement, is to defend your rights. And it's to stand up to this oppression, to stand up to this occupation, to stand up to all the brutal assaults that they have been imposing on our people. But beyond that, we need to start mobilizing every community, in every country, building this global movement that will start from every angle. I'm talking about not militarily, I'm talking about diplomatically, politically, economically, commercially, industrially, technology, human rights, academically, culture, media, and so on and so forth, even in sports entertainment. This is how we're going to shake them up. And that's happening. And this is one of the blessings, because they try to bypass the Palestinian issue. They tried just to bury it under the rug or under the ground and not even to worry about it, and it backfired completely. And now we could see that the whole world is talking about Palestine. Palestine has become the issue, the campus of the struggle, of the future struggle. And we need to seize on this moment and build this movement so that we can face and confront Zionism head on. This is what is going to happen at the end. Once we do that, this whole Zionist project will crumble on itself.
Thank you.
One point, sorry. Can I just say a couple of points, Dr. Sam and Dr. Azam said, just quickly. I think Dr. Azam said that Hamas can go or may go. I think in Gaza it's very complicated to say this. Even if Hamas as a government goes, its people will be integrated in the society unless you kill them all. And I think that's not going to happen, because the ideology that Hamas has built in Gaza, from my experience, I think has been very unique. And back to the point that I have just mentioned, Hamas, in terms of securing the Gaza Strip, has been very extraordinary, which a lot of people would approve of. I think Fatah, in terms of security, hasn't been before Hamas came into power. Fatah, from people's experiences, it wasn't the best. And I think you had some experience in the Fatah, but Hamas, from my experience, has been really extraordinary in securing the Gaza Strip, especially from terrorist settlers and others. But also at the same time, as I just said, like Hamas is part and parcel of the Palestinian fabric. They just can't go. The government can be dissolved, which has happened, but in the end, I just don't agree that Israel should go ahead with its obligation or its demand that not a single one who worked under the Hamas government should be integrated into the National Technocratic Committee, because that can't happen, because you need to eliminate, you're talking about like a very considerable number of people who belong to Hamas. And back to the point of Dr. Sami, like you said, we need to dismantle the Palestinian Authority. I believe that we need to hold those treasonous who committed acts of treason accountable. I don't dispute over that at all. But if we want to dismantle the Palestinian Authority, what options do we have? And at the same time, as I just said, the Palestinian Authority does run and has run during the genocide. And the fact that I'm mentioning this doesn't mean that I'm in favor of this party or that party, but it has contributed to the relief of the Palestinians, although it has an unbelievable avalanche of mistakes and howlers, I would say. It's still contributing to the relief of the Palestinians. So, okay, well, you want to build a unity away from the Palestinian Authority. There are some members within the Palestinian Authority who work within the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and in Gaza out of desperation, because if they just move out of the Palestinian Authority, from where can they get a source of income? From where can they survive? And if you look at Gaza at the moment, you're talking about an unimaginable level of suffering. A lot of people would work, like, for example, can we blame the people who work with Faris Sham, this Emirati-led initiative? We can't blame them. People have no choice at all. So if we want to dismantle them, we need a practical, pragmatic way of talking about this. I agree with you that we need to hold everyone accountable within any political party in Gaza or in Palestine for treason. That's indisputable. But at the same time, if we're talking about this, then what is the alternative that we have? That's why a lot of people would kind of opt for an alternative situation that would give them some kind of reprieve and relief from the ongoing genocide that is happening against them. That's why people are intent on or adamant to have such an option out of desperation and out of amid the inaction. And you said we need a global movement. We've been screaming at the top of our lungs for people outside, the so-called Muslims that I have been utterly disappointed by over the past 3 years, and they haven't done anything. So from where can we move on from that? This is the main question, because that Palestinian, I want to go back to, do you think I love living on an island with respect to Ireland and other countries? Of course, no. Like, life here is unbearable. I would prefer living under genocide than living in Western regimes and Arab regimes countries. I would definitely live under genocide and under bombardment. And it was a mistake, weren't it? Necessary for me, and I had no choice. I wouldn't have left Gaza in the first place. I have never left it in my entire life. So the question that we have, okay, Gaza is Islamic. The pillars of Islam have been like put in place or into effect in the best way possible. I haven't seen Islam much to the level that I've seen in Gaza anywhere across the globe. And I can confess that I'm Hafiz of the Quran, alhamdulillah. I've studied Sharia law for 7 years, and I'm still studying that. I'm not saying I'm a scholar, but I'm still studying all of this. And from what I've seen, I think the level of Iman that Gaza has demonstrated, and from the shares that we have seen, that have been also before October 7th, they have been very critical. The amount of a fleck that has been directed at so-called Arab and Muslim scholars and sheikhs has been outstanding, but nobody has listened at all. That's why we're coming to the same point. Okay, we're going to dismantle this and dismantle this. So what option do we have amid
I can answer that. Well, when we say dismantle, of course, there is not going to be just dismantling of a corrupt regime. There has to be another concept, and we haven't discussed whatever that concept might be. But to have some kind of a Palestinian Authority that is a middle man between occupation and the populace that we have seen for the past 30 years, which really is the first defense, a line of defense of occupation. The role of the Palestinian Authority is not simply that because they provide services to the Palestinians, because always Palestinians will provide service to them. So before the Palestinian Authority, what was there? I mean, there were teachers, Palestinian teachers, and Palestinian laborers, and Palestinian bureaucrats, and they existed. They existed under a different regime. So the fact that you have now Palestinian Authority whose main purpose is to provide security for the settlers and security for this, and then they hand over to it whatever they give them so that they can give out salaries. That's not the issue right now. That's not their role. This is what they do in order to control the population. So we can devise a system. Obviously, this is not going to be an easy system. It's going to be a system that is based on the spirit of resistance. How do we resist under occupation? This is something that I cannot just explain to you in 2 or 3 or 5 minutes. This is something that we need to sit down and talk about it. But somehow, after 30 years, we cannot recognize that this is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. So if it's not the part of the solution, it's part of the problem. What do we replace it with? That's up to the people. But at the end, as I said, we have to remind ourselves, what is the purpose? The purpose of the Palestinian Authority is to keep the Palestinian under control, is to make sure that there will be no real resistance. And I'm not talking about armed resistance, all kinds of resistance against the occupation, and that we will either die slowly or leave the country or do something. I mean, they're trying to figure it out because they have demographic problem. But the most important task for us is to remain on our land and with the least amount of suffering, if possible. But I think that is going to be very difficult because you have a very vicious enemy. Now, as far as the global movement is concerned, there is no way to crumble. The real dismantlement is the dismantlement of the Zionist regime and the Zionist movement. That's the real dismantlement that needs to take place. We, as Palestinians, cannot do that alone. When you look at the 12 pillars that I established, maybe we can impact 3 or 4. How am I going to deal with the nuclear weapons? Nuclear weapons is very important military doctrine to them because they feel so emboldened that if at the last moment, if something happens to them, they can throw and they will have no problem whatsoever using nuclear weapons. So the only way I can neutralize that is to have a Muslim state or another state like Pakistan who will tell Israel, if you use it, it will be used against you. Then I need to neutralize that. That's one of their pillars. How I'm going to be, as a Palestinian, deal with their power and their grip of power over the United States. I need to establish a real movement within the United States in order to weaken this grip. How I'm going to deal with it. So in my 12 pillars, there are 2 dealing with people, 2 dealing with the land, 4 dealing with the military doctrine, military power, nuclear power, and intelligence, 2 dealing with international factors, 2 dealing with regional factors. I am, as Palestinian, can deal with few, but I can't deal with all 12. That means that means the only way is to establish this global movement. Then it's not about few thousand people carrying arms and trying to bring Israel to its heels. That's not going to liberate Palestine. So this is not about a liberation. We need to rid ourselves of this notion that you are on the western side and they are on you are in the eastern side and they are on the western side, and somehow there will be a military conflict. It's like Salah ad-Din, or somehow there is going to be. That's not how it's going to end. Who said that this is the only ending? But this is how people are fed, that this is somehow a military struggle only. It's not a military struggle only. Maybe the last 5 minutes, maybe 5 minutes to 12 to midnight, maybe a military struggle. But during this whole time, there is a huge thing that could be done, but not only by tens of thousands, by millions of people. When you have 12 pillars and each one has a hammer and know exactly where to hit, and millions of people are hitting, these hammers, after a while, they will be weakened and they will crumble. That's the whole point. And there is no shortcut. A lot of people want shortcut. We can have 2 states. We can get a few, we can remove the suffering and all that. There's no shortcut with this enemy. This enemy is there to make sure that this is fight to the end. And we have to understand that. And our strategy should be a long-term strategy. We, as Palestinians, we have one mission: to stay on our land and try to alleviate the suffering as much as possible. That's what we need to do. But in terms of really impacting this Zionist project, in trying to deconstruct this whole idea and trying to dismantle it, that needs much, much more than our capability. The more we can go to people and the more we can convince people to be part of the struggle, the quicker it will happen. But if we still insist on the same things, one of my criticism of the Palestinian groups is that they think that on their own they can liberate. So you talk to this movement or that movement, oh, they want the dua and they want the funds and they want and this and that. That's not going to do it. If Israel was just Israel and this is just a military fight, maybe it's different, but that's not the nature of the conflict. That's not what's taking place.
Fahad, can I address the issue of Hamas?
Yeah, Dr. Zam, I was going to come to you for final comments, because we've kind of gone 15 minutes over. So if you want to address that question, that issue, and then give some closing comments, and then we'll close then. I can put it to the people. I'm happy to stay on and listen to this fascinating discussion, but we did say 8 o'clock, and there are about 150 people on the call at the moment. So we'll carry on. If people want to leave, they can. But I'm respecting your time as well, because we did tell you guys it'd be till 8 o'clock. So please continue, and we can just take a view in it in about 15 minutes.
Well, very briefly, I won't take much time. You see, it's important to understand that these liberation projects are not eternal, and they could easily be defeated along the way. When we talk about the history of the struggle in Palestine, we remember Sheikh Azzuddin al-Qassam. Sheikh Azzuddin al-Qassam wasn't even a Palestinian. He came from Syria. And Sheikh Azzuddin al-Qassam was struggling against British colonialism even before Israel was established. And he was martyred together with his comrades. Yet we still think so highly of him because he fell still adhering to the idea. The idea doesn't die. We talk about Abdul Qadir al-Husseini and the strugglers who were with him in Al-Jihad al-Muqaddas in 1947, 1948. And we speak highly of them because none of them gave up, although they lost their lives or their movement was crushed because of the imbalance in power. The balance of power wasn't in their favor. Hamas didn't exist at one time, and then it existed. It's not the end of the road if Hamas no longer exists. It might be able to regenerate itself, to come back and reorganize itself, mend whatever that is wrong, and heal whatever wounds it has sustained. But even if its project comes to an end, that's not the end of the idea. And what is the idea here? The idea is that Zionism is an attack on this ummah. Zionism is an evil project. Zionism will not have a place in this part of the world. And that's what the struggle is about. So if someone gives up on the struggle, that's one case. And we saw this with the case of the Fatah leadership and the PLO leadership, who turned the National Liberation Movement of the Palestinians into a collaborating agency with the occupation. But we can also see the models of Azzuddin al-Qassam and Abdul Qadir al-Husseini being repeated, in that you are defeated militarily, you get crushed, but you don't give up on the idea, and then somebody else will come and carry the banner forward. And I think this is what matters. No human being, no project, no institution is sacred, but the idea is sacred, and it is the idea that we adhere to.
Okay, so I think we will finish there, and I'm really grateful for all of the panelists' time. I know you're very, very busy people. A lot of questions are unanswered, and a lot of people are asking, can we have a part 2 to go into more depth? And I'll discuss it, inshallah. I hope we are able to do that. Just want to thank Dr. Samuel Ari and Dr. Zam Tamimi and Abu Bakr Abid for sharing their expertise, their rigorous policy analysis, and first-hand insights into what is a very complex historical issue. This has been a joint effort of Riverway to the Sea and Cage International. We try to organize discussions and engage in topics that others are completely unwilling to touch. It is your generosity that drives our mission to confront and dismantle Zionism. We're asking that if you're happy with these type of programs and to build long-term stability for our mission, we would like monthly donations, if possible, from everybody in this call. We're looking for 500 people to donate £5 a month. That would help us sustain this long term. So we don't want to, and we don't intend to seek any funding from any government institution. And that allows us to maintain the independence and keep going with programs like this. So the link was in the chat box. If you can donate, we'd be very, very grateful. We have programs coming up. The next program is going to be some training for asylum lawyers about how to deal with cases of Israeli nationals, Jews who are anti-Zionist, or Palestinian citizens of Israel, how they can claim asylum in Britain and elsewhere. Again, part of that attack on the Zionist state, part of attacking its reputation, its narrative, and exposing what happens to anti-Zionists within the so-called State of Israel. So that's coming up in September, so stay tuned for that one as well. Thank you very much again for everyone for attending, for all our panelists, and inshallah we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.